really came at Reverend Caldwell, in my opinion, quite hard. And Dale said, you know, we're here, my dad's birthday, we don't want any trouble or anything. But it just showed me that it's one thing to come to a program like this, and it's one thing to talk about we need to change things. But Reverend Caldwell has put himself on the battle lines for years. And he's put up with people like this that were there to cause him harm. I mean, not just always with words, but with other things. And that just stayed with me for days. I just could not stop thinking about that. So the next time that maybe you hear somebody say something inappropriate, just think about Reverend Caldwell and what he's done with his life. And sometimes put yourself out there maybe a little bit more, because that is the only way you're going to change the world. So anyway, as far as Reverend Caldwell, he's the co-founder of Black Methodists for Church Renewal and United Methodists for a Fully Inclusive Church. He was a civil rights leader, and in fact, somewhere here, I have a picture of a little bit younger Reverend Caldwell, and
Not much.
oh, he's covered his buttons. And so he has been working with the civil rights movement for almost his entire career. He was a civil rights movement activist alongside Dr. Martin Luther King, and he continues to build bridges between activists of all types. Currently, he's turned his attention to the LGBTQ rights in the U.S. as well as in the United Methodist Church. And I'm sure that they will get into this tonight. There's a big article today in the New York Times that the Methodist Church has decided to reinforce a ban on gay marriage. So it's very timely that we have him with us tonight. And along with Reverend Caldwell is his son, Dale Caldwell. He's an executive director at the Rothman Institute of Innovation and Entrepreneurship, as well as the founder and CEO of Strategic Influence, LLC. He is the author of several books on leadership, success, and education. He holds an MBA from the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. And this is really very little about what these two men are about. I mean, we could spend the entire night pretty much talking about their bios. Yeah. But without any more discussion, I want to open the program to Reverend Caldwell and Dale Caldwell. Thank you so
much. Good evening, everybody. I'm going to start out. My dad and I have enjoyed doing a kind of a tag team where I kind of kick it off, and then I'll interview him a little later. And so, one of the things, we're not experts on transgender issues or other issues, but we have spent some time, and my dad has been on the battlefield for human rights. And so because of my dad and because of Dr. King and others, and with a business background, I've developed a framework that not only helps in the business world, but outside of it. So as we kind of, and what the framework does is about helping people understand themselves a little better. And I think that's where we're going to start in the next few minutes, and then open up for questions, because that's the issue that we're dealing with, and I'm sure people are here for many different reasons, and we'll find out about that. The other thing is that this should be interactive. This is not a lecture. We want you to and we like it, Dad and I, right? We like it when you disagree with us. That makes it fun. But we want to be open and honest, because it's about you, and it's about really getting some things done. And so my dad and I started this foundation, really to focus on a number of human issues. And so this is a process we call effective empathy and gender identity. And it just so happens, I'm president of something called the Educational Services Commission of New Jersey, which is the largest special needs school district in the state. There's students that are multiply disabled, students that have on the autism spectrum, and students that have emotional challenges. And just so happened on Friday, when I was leading the meeting, we had a woman from Rutgers who is one of the national experts on gender identity. And I have never learned so much from her presentation. I mean, really, and that article here, which I encourage each of you to read, talks about this in schools. And we'll talk a little later about some of the issues that come up. But I want to start, and I start with this thing. And there's a guy named Carl Sagan. Remember Carl Sagan?
Yeah.
Late Carl Sagan? And he wanted people to understand the universe. And so he had some scientists, and they put the history of the universe, if it was in a year, what it would look like. And so if there was such a thing as the Big Bang, it would be January 1st. And then Earth would be around September 25th. But the important thing is that human beings would be on Earth December 31st about 10 p.m. And so the whole message of this is that why do we have racism and hate and all these things? We are still trying to figure out how to get together. So, you know, we can fly around the world, we can use technology, but we can't interact as human beings. And so part of what we need to understand in this discussion is that we're still in the embryonic stage of this thing called human interaction. So don't feel bad, and it's easy to get angry at some other people who don't get it, but I want to talk about why they don't get it. So I was going to write a book on leadership, and there are a million books on leadership. And I knew mine was going to be one of the better ones, and you know, but I'm kind of an etymologist, and I like to study words. And I looked up the definitions of leadership, command, and authority, and the word influence came in that definition. So about 10 years ago, it forced me to understand this thing called influence. And I discovered it's a word that's hidden in plain sight. That you'll look on the news and the internet or TV, and you'll say, she's influential, he's influential, yet we don't really define what that means. And so it's really important to understand that, because we do what we do, think the way we think, and accomplish what we accomplish because of influence. And so what I mean by that are, for example, English accents. That no child in the world is born with an English accent. They could be born in Brooklyn or Sydney, Australia, or London or Johannesburg, South Africa, and develop a very different English accent that often stays with them for the rest of their life. So think about all of the things that we're influenced. Our culture, our religion, who we think is attractive, our favorite food, all these, our favorite sports team. All these things are based on our influence. We're not born with that. And so when you begin to think about that and think about why people look at things a certain way, it's because of influence. And the example in the research, I'm at Fairleigh Dickinson University, so I'm writing some research papers and doing more research. And in that research, I've discovered I know what the best music in the world is. Anybody know what the best music in the world is?
R&B.
And when I do that, I didn't have the music. But the best music in the world, the research shows that, is for girls are always ahead of boys. For girls, it's between ages 13 and 25, and for boys, between ages 14 and 25. That's when you first really start developing music, and that's their favorite music.
Oh, yeah.
That's the best music in the world. And so why is that important? Well, that's important because we would never try to, we will try, but we will never be able to convince somebody that my music is better than your music. Yet that's what we're trying to do when we deal with issues. We're trying to understand people's music, and we're trying to convince people that their music is wrong. And their music may be racism. They may have been born, their music may be racism. And so, you know, we're not going to say, well, that's stupid, that's wrong. But we have to understand another perspective. And so my dad and I were at a program in New York, and my dad was speaking, and they asked me to speak, and I talked about that music analogy for like 5 minutes. Afterwards, 2 women who happened to be white came up to me after that and said, I love that analogy, because my dad, both of them said their dad was racist. And I hear his music in my head. Whenever he would see a mixed couple, he would mutter something. And so many of us are still hearing that music in our head. So when we come to gender identity, we're hearing that music. You know, love is between a man and a woman. That's the music we hear. And so we need to understand, not to excuse, but understand where people are coming from. So if we're going to make significant change, we need to really think about this. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And think about the music. So my influences. So you saw that picture with this young man over here, Ralph Abernathy and Dr. King. And when was that, Dad? When was that?
That was the press conference in Boston in 1965.
About what? What were you guys doing?
We invited Martin King to come to Boston because, as you probably some of you know, that Boston had some segregation problems in its public schools. And we had a message that was in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and I was involved in that, and we invited Martin King to come to Boston. And so we had a press conference, and there I was presiding. Also, that was the time when I introduced him on the Boston Common and spoke to 22,000 people. So that was an interesting time back in the day.
So this next one of you standing next to Dr. King marching.
And I didn't realize he has all of this on his, my goodness.
Yeah. But it's, you know, so, and we'll get a little more into that, but I want to just kind of lay out. So we did this framework and this 4 steps of influence, understanding how we've been influenced, understanding. So as you're going through the process of thinking about gender identity and thinking about things in a different way, we have to understand our influences, what our music is when it comes to that. And we all have to be honest about the fact that not everybody is completely tolerant. Some people say, okay, I can, my friends are gay, I understand that. Transgender, I don't quite understand. And it's okay to be honest to yourself to really understand what that is. And then kind of understand what is the impact of that. Once you understand your music, what is the impact? How does that impact how I view the world, how I interact with people? The next is we'll go influence management. Once you understand that, what do I need in my life to kind of move forward? Could be sessions like this. Could be spending time talking to someone who's different and really understanding where they come from. And one of the assignments that I give folks when I talk is I want you to go and talk to somebody you either don't know or you don't like, and spend some time with them. Maybe even break bread. But the key is to ask them who their influences were. And so oftentimes what that does is changes the relationship. And especially the more you don't understand that person, the more important it is. And the example I used to say, and I talk to a lot of work groups, they say, in the morning, people say, how's your day? Nobody really cares. And I say, if you don't believe me, the test is, when someone says, how's your day, say, hey, do you have 5 minutes? Let me tell you how my day is. right? And so they don't, but when you ask them who their influence is, that changes the relationship. And you will find, and I love it when people do that to someone you'll find that there's a reason why they do that. And so it's important to think about. And then finally, influence maximization is about doing that. So what I wanted to do, and this is the book. And so one of the things that really hit me, and with the Methodist Church, my involvement there, and I was on the board of the United States Tennis Association, is that this process is about developing empathy. It's really about developing empathy. But there's this thing called, that I'm not, obviously empathy is understanding others' feelings, experiences, and influences. Well, there's this thing that I call ineffective empathy. And much of what we're dealing with in places like the Methodist Church and others is understand, it's not enough just to understand people's problems, to understand their problems, but devise solutions that are beneficial to you. And so, the golden rule is to do unto others as you would have them do unto yourself. And I say we need to go further. Do unto others as they would have you do unto them. Because it's arrogant for them to do, I'm going to do to you because my music is different. It's basically saying, I'm going to give you the music that I like. That's insensitive. I've got to give you the music that you like. So it's to kind of open up this discussion as we think about our own biases and prejudices, we need to think about that. And so there's this thing called effective empathy, which is really understanding others' feelings and implementing solutions to challenges that are mutually beneficial. That make sense?
Yeah.
And so part of this, we preach to the choir, but part of it is just for you to take people that are less tolerant, to really kind of use this to really understand their music and kind of get them to become more. I wish I had given this to the Methodist Church before. We could have changed. I guarantee I could have changed 26 votes. So some of you may have heard that the Methodist Church, voted to get. Yeah, well, and so one of the.
Finish the sentence.
So one of the. So the cover of the New York Times article, which is up here, that the Methodist Church for 2 years was waiting for this past weekend to really talk about the issue of whether they're going to allow folks who profess as being gay to be pastors, to marry folks. And I thought I actually was tearing when I read the bishop's write-up that it should be a no-brainer. Because I have a 14-year-old daughter, and to her this issue is like wearing a blue shirt.
Yeah.
It's like as if the Methodist Church said you can't wear blue shirts in church. It's just such a ridiculous thing. And yet because they're influenced, and most of America understood, but other countries voted against it because their music was that. And so this is just the thing that we talked about with the influences. But this is some of the things that I learned, and so in this discussion, and then we'll tee up and I'll interview Dad. That sex is, a complex combination of physiological characteristics, including chromosomes, hormones, and anatomy. And this is out of that article, so I encourage you to get that article because she's a national expert, and so often because our music is binary, you're male or female, right? And regularly assigned at birth based on genitalia. And so approximately 1 to 2% of people are intersex, and their physical bodies do not conform to standard definitions of male and female. And so they're physiological things. And then Dr. Melinda Mangan from Rutgers. And so as opposed to gender, So gender is one's internal sense of identity. And that people whose gender identities match their sex assigned at birth are cisgender. People whose gender identity does not match sex assigned at birth are transgender. One of the things I learned is that, and she had a whole PowerPoint of, there are about 100 terms that are new. One was demisexual. And so demisexual is someone who only is interested in having sex with someone they're in love with, which people assume everybody was demisexual. So you see, and so you start reading the different definitions of things, and you see, and then they talk about the physiological and neurological roots in it. And I wish this kind of thing had been I wish he had presented to the Methodist Church, because you start to see the reality instead of our own music of this binary. Anything other than this binary definition is wrong.
I have to say things because I'll forget them at my age, but I just want to put them back. That in the church, and we'll get into this, the church, the Bible gets in the way.
Yeah,
The Bible gets in the way, and therefore the Bible defines for people what is, and in fact the scriptures do not encompass what actually is. So we'll talk more about that.
Yeah, we'll talk some about. And so actually, so in the United States, about 0.6% of adults, 1.4 million people identify as transgender. So that's the latest research. And so gender expansive is challenging cultural expectations regarding gender roles, identities, expressions, and norms. It may further describe, people who are gender expansive further describe themselves as non-binary, gender fluid, or gender queer. The ever-changing language mirrors our growing understanding that gender can be experienced in many different ways. But there's variety, and that's beautiful. And so as we begin to think about this, and it's not many, we didn't grow up with this music. This is a very different music for some of us, but we can appreciate other music. And those of you, again, who are here are looking to appreciate other music. We need to kind of let the world know that there is other music and it's okay. And so estimates suggest that 0.7% of teenagers aged 13 to 17 identify as transgender. That means approximately 150,000 youth identify as transgender. So schools with more than 143 children are therefore likely to have at least one transgender student. So this is reality. So her presentation is really talking about schools. One of the challenges in schools, and I'm president of actually three school boards, is that if Johnny was given the name Johnny by their parents, but wants to be called Sally in the classroom, it's illegal for the teacher to tell the parent. The old music would say, of course, the first thing I'm going to do is call up. Do you know that Johnny wants to be Sally? Districts will be sued because of that. And so, and it's because it's a personal, then it's up to the child to share that. And so we're entering a very different world. There's very different music. And there's music in this new world that I think all of us in some way or another are uncomfortable with. And that's okay. And then finally, we talked about these three things. So we'll get right to the discussion. But one of the things I learned, so my first job out of Wharton, we have a fellow Wharton alum there, is that I went to consulting and I learned to be comfortable being uncomfortable. Because every day you're given a new project, so you've got to be able to learn things real quickly. And I think this new society, we have to be comfortable being uncomfortable. We have to be comfortable learning and not knowing stuff. And so if a child comes to us or a friend comes to us and says stuff, we have to be comfortable with that. So with that, Dad, I want to tee you up. Do you want to turn your chair around?
Yeah.
You want to come up here? Any questions about that? Does that make sense?
Yes.
My goal is always to get you thinking differently. So.
Where does tolerance fit in? Is that a factor at all?
Well, that's great. Actually, funny.
Or is that too middle of the road?
No, I was going to. So I did actually a sermon. I think I did at Red Bank about tolerance, and so this was about empathy. And someone was saying, empathy can be arrogant. I can empathize with your little problems. And then I realized that they're kind of different levels of tolerance. And I went to the Museum of Tolerance and said, tolerance isn't that great. So you kind of go from tolerance to concern to care to empathy. And so I created a word that I call interness, which is, some would say agape or Ubuntu, but it's that you and I are different, but I care as much about you as I do about myself. And that's a term, kind of this interness, and I think we have to move towards that interness.
Let me say this because I'll forget it. I'll say it, and this is maybe the first time I've said this to my son. This was one of the most stimulating lectures I've ever heard. It's interesting, you know. First, we've done this in different ways, but just the excitement of this. In fact, I get the music idea better than I had before, because actually you're using music not only for music as I understand it, but simply in terms of influence and what happens in our early ages. Let me just say a couple of things. And by the way, I want to say that I have the experience of colorblindness for the first time. Of course, that's been one of the issues, you know, in terms of people who say, I don't see color. But I've shared with people, and Dale knows that my glaucoma is really working out. And I've got an operation coming up this coming Friday with my left eye. And I see all of you look the same. I think I have a feeling some of you may know about this. In fact, somebody said they know glaucoma. I wonder if the lights have different effects on people. In fact, for instance, going in Wegmans, and someone I know said that, gee, one of the reasons you get old, that the lights and the fluorescent lights have an impact on you. And so my mother became legally blind, and she used to talk about everything is cloudy, you know. And now I'm beginning to see what she's talking about. So I want to simply say that, so that if I don't recognize your gender or your ethnicity or your race, understand that I'm not seeing well.
That just means you're getting younger.
But this, I just, in terms of, and Dale and Noel will say that I go off track here. I'm excited more so for the series that I think I had then, because this whole idea, let's talk about race, which was award-winning, I understand, and you've been doing that for a while. The idea of recognizing, and I've always said it, that to talk about race is to talk about much more than race. And this is a perfect illustration of what I'm talking about. And I guess the thing I'm wrestling with is that how, particularly in the USA, can persons who are not black get themselves into the black experience, because there is something about the black experience that has some universal qualities that we don't yet understand. I've sometimes said that the black experience, what do they use that phrase, that the canary in the tunnel? You remember that the canary in the tunnel, of course, was there for the miners, for the canary would find out negatively sometimes if there was something toxic. And I guess I simply want to say that the black experience in the USA, and in fact in the world, is somehow one that sort of gives forewarnings of what's going on in the mind. And I guess I would simply say, without getting into a political discussion, that in fact the black experience, in fact, understands where we are as a nation right now than a lot of other people. Because for us, it's been there all along. Yeah. And I think now the covers are being pulled off, and therefore how you get at that is important. I know a particular church, and I won't identify the church, but after the election, when of course our president was elected, people were shocked to find out that some of those members voted for the president who won. And that created some interesting dynamics in that particular church. And therefore one was surprised that people whom they thought of as, let's use the term progressive, discovered that they were not voting for what they thought was the most progressive candidate. But I mean, what you're saying, Dale, it makes a lot of sense, that one of the things that we're not getting into is, even as we disagree, getting into understanding why. And I think we are making assumptions, and sometimes negatively, about the why. And in fact, you know, we're suggesting, for instance, I would, and shut me off. On that, because I think it relates to what you're saying. You see, from my perspective, as an 85-year-old African-American man, with, in fact, again, now this is not political, because I've been both Republican and Democrat in my journey, so don't feel Caldwell as a traditional, liberal. But I would simply say that the history of our present president, in terms of being a race-based owner of buildings, in terms of what he did vis-a-vis the Central Park 5, you know about that, or in terms, most seriously, in terms of the birth kind of thing, that was so negative in terms of my experience and my reality that I could not imagine embracing with all of the gifts that he brought. But obviously that's not everybody's music, you see, I guess. That they did not understand that in fact, because that was not their music was shaking of Washington. Or their music was something of jobs, turning the situation upside down. And I guess I'll stop right there, but I guess that's what makes this session great. And I guess my hope is that there are some people who did not come tonight, I'm sure, because race nor gender is my thing. But just we miss out on so many things because we don't think that speaks to me. When in fact, I just think, as you said it so very well, that this is an opportunity for all of us to grow. I use Elizabeth Kubler-Ross wanting to live until I die. I want to learn until I die. And therefore, I like what you said. What about comfort, uncomfortable?
Being comfortable, being uncomfortable. Being
comfortable
comfortable, being
but
uncomfortable.
Okay, now that's another thing. That's the black experience. that being uncomfortable in America. I mean, I talk about, and I could go on. I talk about how, as Grace and I went to racial segregated schools in the South and reciting the Pledge of Allegiance, that we cited a Pledge of Allegiance and at the end said, with liberty and justice for all. That's a lie. That's a lie. And therefore that made us uncomfortable, but for some people, they didn't notice that. Because in fact, their sense is not being uncomfortable. And I guess this is so important, but let me stop right there. This is
Well, but to build on that, Dad, and so again, and Dad is, my dad always likes talking about, holding everybody accountable and controversial issues. And so part of the reason I like this is that even those that have been victims have their own music and their own biases. And so I want you to talk about your disappointment with a lot of the black ministers who have come through the movement, whose music was, equal rights for blacks and whites, but not equal rights for transgender. Talk about that.
Okay, and Dale can help me because I do. But there's a phrase I learned a phrase that I'm not remembering. I wish that I had. Someone is suggesting that even in a group that's been outside the wall, whether it's race or gender or something else, that there is within that group a need to be able to look down on somebody else. There's a name for that.
Pecking order?
Well, that's kind of a pecking order. And what there is about human beings is that persons who have been outside have still a need to make some other people outsiders.
Yeah.
And I think that's been one of my concerns. And I guess this is where I've had some real interesting struggles as an African American pastor who is an ally advocate of gay rights. Simply because, and I will share my own experience, that in the 1970s, there was a white, and I might have shared this here before, a white Episcopal priest whose name was Malcolm Boyd. Malcolm Boyd wrote a marvelous book, Are You Running With Me, Jesus? And he was active as a civil rights activist. And I was deeply impressed by Malcolm Boyd, and so I was a fan of his. And all of a sudden, Malcolm Boyd announced to his Episcopal church and to the nation that I'm gay, I'm a gay man. And I had to ask for a few minutes, Caldwell, do you burn his books? Do you say that he didn't have an impact on you? And I guess I have to ask myself, I've not really asked myself, what was the music that I'd internalized that I had not internalized? That made me have that kind of knee-jerk response when in fact I heard that he was gay. Now we'll get into this because I am a critic, obviously a person of faith who believes in Scripture. We in the Methodist Church have an interesting kind of way of approaching Scripture. We call it the quadrilateral. That there's Scripture, but then there's an understanding of tradition, there's experience, and then there's reason. And therefore you bring those four kinds of things. And so one of my challenges is that if in fact one simply believes that one can be literalistic in terms of the Scriptures, that everything in Scripture is righteous and right, first of all, that does not recognize the contradictions in Scripture. That Scripture is not consistent. I mean, there are 2 or 3 creation stories in Scriptures. You have to acknowledge that. And simply, there are other kinds of things. I mean, there's some of you may know the name of John Shelby Spong, who wrote a marvelous book talking about the sins of Scripture. And simply talking about how, in fact, if you simply literalize Scripture, and therefore there are some pretty negative things in Scripture about killing people, etc. And that's been one of my concerns. And that's why I'll just go into the Methodist Church. that so often in the missionary movement, as persons work with persons, and this is the issue national, a literalistic Bible. Therefore, one picks out a phrase that talks about marriage as being only between one man and woman. That's, it's amazing how people jump on that when you look at the Hebrew Bible and
But as you're talking, I'm thinking, so we use the analogy of music, that what happens is people use the Bible to pull out their own music.
Okay.
Right? So they're reading in the Bible things that reinforce the music that they like.
I said, yeah, bias in the Bible.
Right, exactly. So that's what they're...
And that's weaponizing, which we call it, that's weaponizing the Bible. And then using the Bible to bash people unlike yourself.
Talk about the curse of Ham.
Yeah. Oh, of course, that's it. And I have any of you, knowing the history of the Bible and Noah's curse and the mark of Cain, have you bumped into that in terms of the racial implications of that?
Oh, yeah.
You know it. You see, you know about that. Some of you, but it's of course in the scriptures and in Genesis, I guess. Of course, Noah. You know that name, Noah. Of course, became drunk, and of course became naked in that drunkenness. One of his sons exposed his nakedness, and therefore Noah imposed a curse on that son. And somehow in the whole process of tribes emerging out of that, and I'm not able to speak clearly tonight, but therefore a tribe of black people became, that they had a curse. They were less than. And we've not been as open about that in church. The Mormons, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints have been very honest about that. They say that they kept black men out of their priesthood because of what the Bible said about this curse of Ham. But then in the they got a revelation, and therefore that revelation said that was not true, and therefore they decided that we can accept that. The problem is that the United Methodist Church has not gotten that revelation, and we're too proud and too intellectual, and therefore we believe in reason. But the unreasonability of saying that the practice of homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching, simply because of a few verses in the Bible, and that's sort of where we are. We'll get into that.
But again, I don't know that it's even that more you're talking. More I'm realizing they're hearing what they want to hear.
Exactly.
Out of it. And so one of the, so I've written a couple books on the fruit of the Spirit, because everybody talks about God and Jesus Christ, and I wanted to learn about the Holy Spirit. And so,
I mean, there are some people not in the Christian tradition.
So the Holy Spirit talks about the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering, gentleness, goodness, faith, meekness, and self-control. So they're words that everybody can live by. But if you look at the Greek and actually have the Greek translation, there actually no English translation Bible has it exactly right. So I can prove that the Bible is not literal, that every Bible has words that are wrong. But that's why I go back to the music, that what people want to do is pull out of the Bible, I don't want to forget that passage, let me pull out this passage, and so that, but that's the big hammering rod to try to hit people over the head. So again, now the other side too, we talked about some black leaders who are anti-gay, but there are, you've interacted with some people who are gay, who are not sensitive to issues of race. And so often we think that we have a past because our group has been hurt. And so we need to understand, again, our music and how we view the world, and realize that we need to realize that life is different, and accept people where they are and understand their influences. So with that, I want to open up for some questions, discussion. We've thrown some stuff out. I have a whole bunch more questions for my dad, but any questions, comments, thoughts? Yeah.
I'm very impressed with what you've said so far, and I'm going to ask you a question that I hope will not seem too frivolous. I voted this year for Black Klansman as the best film. Now you know about history, and I don't. So I want to know, what did you think of that movie?
Now, are you one of the voters?
I voted. I voted for that, for Best Picture over Green.
So you're among the Oscar voters.
So you're not part of the Academy. You're not a part of the Academy.
I'm part of the union.
Yes, yes.
But anyway, that's not important.
Yeah.
I want to know, did you see Black Klansman, and what about the historical perspective, which I, being a white person, thought was brilliant, but it could be all wrong, you could tell me.
I get that's very important. And this is a different music. That green door,
Green book.
Green book.
Green book. Right.
green book lifted up the music of some people, and that was the issue. That therefore, you see, Black Panther and the Klansmen spoke to the experience of black persons. I mean, sort of being outside the door. Whereas people unconsciously or consciously, the Green Book, as well as Driving Miss Daisy, a benevolent white person, who in fact was the hero or heroine. And therefore, you see, that the suggestion, and that, I don't know that people understand that the nuance there. But in a sense, you got really a white hero in the Green Book, you know, in terms of how he related to how he grew, you see. He therefore becomes the center, even though of course.
Yeah, I missed that totally.
Yeah, you see, but so it's exactly. I mean,
No, I really missed that. Go
yeah,
ahead.
exactly. So I mean, and I think one of the things you see when people realize that and we all miss something, how do you suggest we handle that? Because I mean, the fact of the matter is that we all that one of the things in the church you say is that we all are less than we ought to be. All of us are sinners. And my dad, my father, my preacher father used to say that the church is not a rest home for saints, but a hospital for sinners.
That's right.
And in fact, I mean, and that's it. And that to me is important. Like religious institutions, academic institutions, and even libraries are places where you stretch. It's sort of like a gym, you know, that you go there. What is it? No gain, no gain,
No pain, no
pain, no gain. So yeah.
Well, so one of the things too, and we're talking openly when my dad and I talk, and so one of the things that if you look on stage, and so this is about being empathetic for, you know, as an African American. Now the Green Book, a lot of people didn't know what the Green Book was, and obviously that, you know, but to see on stage 30 people who are white with 2 black people celebrating something that is a part of Black America, there's nothing wrong with it. I appreciate that people brought it up, but it's important to understand that picture. That here's something that was, you know, that black people had to have to navigate through basic parts of this country. And it was celebrated, but there weren't many black people in the production of this thing.
For the family.
And again, and so part of the thing, so I was on the governor's budget transition committee, and because I used to be deputy commissioner of the Department of Community Affairs, so I didn't have necessarily a connection with the governor. And so one of the things that I said, that, you know, that for a lot of reasons, that you can't force opportunities for small business, veteran business, minority businesses, and women businesses. You can't really force businesses to spend money with them. But I had suggested, put it on the website. How much money are you spending with minority, women, you know, other businesses? And people, oh, great idea. Well, it hasn't happened. And so there's not a real seriousness about inclusion. So one of the things I talked to a lot of companies about diversity and inclusion, because it used to be diversity. Diversity was enough. We have people and things, but there's no inclusion. There's very little inclusion, and I think part of what we need to do, and that's not just for African Americans, that's for, you know, for all people of color. And I think we who care have to be a little more vocal about inclusion, to say that it's great. I'm glad you celebrated this stuff. But at what point are you going to realize that the people who put this on should look like America?
Let me jump in there because, and again, I guess both because of my site, but the New York Times had an op-ed, was it today, and I just read it sort of quickly about women, and the person was simply suggesting that there's more than statistics in terms of the number. Did anybody read that article in the Times? I don't remember the headline. It was on the op-ed page today in terms of a person writing about there's more to women, and it applies to all persons on the outside. It seems to me, as I was reading it, is that it's evaluating the statistics in terms of numbers, but still acknowledging that there's more to that than simply because, in fact, you may, in fact, I think some women would say that one of the ways to be involved with men, of course, is to act like men, you see, rather than being yourself. And I think that's true racially, etc. So I'm not saying that well, but that so happens. You bring these things out of me. I don't know, where we learn this.
He's a manipulator.
That's the way.
Yes.
Oh, that's a great question, yeah, yeah.
All right, we have this music tonight, and we probably can't change the music, and we can't change it in anybody else. But could we develop a playlist?
Well, but appreciation.
You know, could we have more than one type of music going on?
Now, see, I don't even know, I hear that term, what's a playlist? That shows
Well, I'm not sure I know.
No, that's.
A
But
list
it's-
of songs.
A list of your favorite songs.
A list of songs,
Yeah.
and you,
That you listen to them through what device?
I guess any,
Well,
I don't have some.
No, I'm trying to go public with my Neanderthal approach.
Yeah, well, I'm a Neanderthal too.
but that's part of what I really am saying, is that to begin, you can't really change people's
Yeah.
favorite music,
Yeah.
but you can help them appreciate your music.
Yeah.
And so part of this is really helping people appreciate the music and appreciate the perspective and appreciate why. But the other thing that I didn't say is that it's this influence, it's called intelligent influence in the book. It's a learned competency that you have to practice thinking about where other people are coming from. So I'm in New York all the time, and I'm on the subway, and I practice it, and I say, well, what influenced him to wear that? You know, and so you start to really think about, and the more you practice it, you begin to develop some skill in kind of thinking about where people are coming from. And the more you do it, the more interesting people get. Because when you start to realize people are products of their influence, everybody's fascinated. There's a reason, there's an influence reason all of you are sitting here today. And we can sit with you and kind of pull out, why do you care about this issue? Why do you care about my dad? Why do you care? And it's fascinating.
But
Yeah.
don't we tend to use our own experiences in it, like you said about the guy with the shirt? Now, maybe that was the only clean shirt he had.
And
I mean,
it may
you know,
have been. It may have been.
We're
And-
trying
yeah.
to make judgments without really knowing.
Well, but see, that's why it shouldn't be a judgment as
Yeah.
much as it should be
Yeah.
trying to hear their music.
Yeah.
And what I found in this influence is it allows me not to be judgmental. Because I realize that everybody is a product of that. And then I often say something, but that is that everybody's born as an empty glass. And their influences are poured in them. There's some genetics with the physiology, but it's poured into them. And so you start to appreciate that.
Well, where do you relate the song that I mentioned before, First South Pacific? You've got to be carefully taught. People love the people is hate by the time you're 6, 7, or 8. Now, how do you fit that into your firm?
What's South Pacific?
See,
See, that's your music. That's your music.
Yeah, when did South Pacific come out? I mean, is it?
I was in the.
So if you start, I encourage you. I was listening to one of my favorite songs, and I said when I first read this, is a guy named Nicholas Davidoff, who actually was in charge of big data for Google, and he went on Spotify to really look and verify that 14 to 24 is when people learn that. And I kind of tested it, one of my favorite songs, and it was literally when I was 14. And it came out. So I encourage you to find the song that you listen to and see when it happened in your life. And it doesn't always perfect. Yeah, go ahead.
Since we were talking about movies, I watched a documentary called The 13th.
Yeah.
And you were talking about how we have to learn the Black experience before we can. And after watching that, I was so disturbed and angry at how many separate ways our country and our government and our society is set up against Black people in so many ways. And it seems like you want to do the best you can do, and then it seems like it runs so deep, you don't know where to start. And I sat there at the end of it. If you haven't seen it, it's amazing. You need to watch it. But I sat there at the end of the documentary, and I was just so angry, and I wanted to do something, but it's not. I can't do this with every person I meet, So I just how do you channel that into change?
Well, and a couple things about that too, is that we have to understand the political divide is actually intended to maintain the status quo. If we're sitting there arguing about conservative and liberal, we're ignoring the realities. And the realities are race, but poverty as well. And so you look at the combination of race and poverty, you're basically done in this country. You're done. And so one of the things, again, it's mindset. That one of the things that I say is that there is no reason to have poverty in America. And you don't have to care about poor people, but if I'm rich and poor people have money, then I get richer. And and so terminologies are really important. And your generation now with social media, words become really important. And so when I was Deputy Commissioner of the Department of Community Affairs, I was in an anti-poverty conference and everybody was talking about the safety net. And I like to be controversial, said, I don't believe in the safety net. I believe in the safety trampoline. Because the safety net catches people and keeps them here. Safety trampoline bounces people back up. And we need to have a responsibility. It's not enough just to give money to feed the poor. That we have a responsibility, especially if you look at reparations and other things, to really help people with jobs, not necessarily with welfare, but with jobs to help them bounce back into society. And what happens is when you're black and you're poor, you are, and then policies of both parties put people there. And not necessarily intentionally, but the policies, nobody thinks through. And yet part of the thing, and part of where my dad and I disagree some, is this celebrity culture drives me crazy. Because we're allowing these celebrities as if they're smarter than most of us to make decisions. And they're making decisions that are in their best interest and not making decisions to eliminate poverty. So my thing is that anybody in office, there is no reason to have poverty. But we live in this idea of the self-made man. This idea that you pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. And guess what? No human being on earth has done that. And yet we allow that to permeate. So if you're poor, it's because you didn't work as hard as I did. And we've got to move away from that and realize that not everybody started on third base. And so when you look at those things and you begin to, so it's not even just the black issue, it's the issue that we as a society, America is better off if everybody has a chance to get a job and everybody has an opportunity to succeed.
One of the interesting things, just in terms of economics, I'm interested and I haven't followed it, but three of the Democratic potential candidates are talking about reparations. Now, of course, that's a challenging word, but I think at some point there are at least two of you from Wharton School in the House too, so you will have all the economic answers in terms of. But I guess we have to sort of ask ourselves, what's the phrase? Is the economy stupid?
Yeah.
Where does money fit into this? Where does capitalism fit in all of this, in terms of what we're talking about? But later on, we might need to get to that. But I guess in terms of this whole question, I suggest that there is a need for a reparation spirit in our nation to acknowledge how society, political and otherwise, has been stacked against a certain group of people. And how you factor in the fact that to build this economy, this nation imported black slaves to provide free slave labor. And therefore, what does that mean? And how do you get at that? When in fact, and in a sense, the economy that we boast about is what's a word without built on? Well, it's not pure. I mean, it's tainted. It's tainted. It's tainted by the way this nation built itself economically. And of course, we're talking about a lot of kind of things, and I have a way of mixing things up. But there's a lady out there has a comment.
You just brought up two things to my mind. You said one thing and you said the other. But the first thing is, there's a lot of young black men who are not trained they drop out of high school, and then there's no job training for them. So when they say go out and get a job, they have no training and I know because I happen to be in a neighborhood right now where I'm seeing that. And I'm just amazed. Here it is, what, 2019? Yeah, 2020. And senior moment. And it's still the same. And then there's a statement that Mr. I can't remember the last name. Caldwell said that also brought up. I wrote down what Martin Luther King said in a statement about Europeans came over here and they were able to, meld into society. But what people have to understand is that the African came over here as a slave. They never had the opportunities. And then it goes on and on and on. So those were...
Well, that's it, and I want to get to, you were saying, so when I say poverty, and that's what this foundation is really focused on, is reducing financial, educational, and emotional poverty. And you can't eliminate poverty with money alone. You give people money they can't read, that money doesn't go that well. You give people money they can read, but they're dealing with emotional issues. And so a term, I was running a school in Trenton, which is 95% African American, and I realized that many of our kids had something like PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yes.
So I coined a term called urban traumatic stress disorder because it's not post. What happens is they're in chaos, they come to a nice school and they go back to chaos. And the neuroscience says that the amygdala actually changes. And it has nothing to do with how smart you are, but your ability to focus, as it is with folks coming back from the military. We're doing a lot of work with veterans. And so, but things like mindfulness actually can help to turn it around. So and this is all part of our safety trampoline, is the idea that we need to be responsible for this entire society of helping them find jobs. And so one of the other things we're doing is what we call an audition temp agency, is that many people who've been long-term unemployed, businesses aren't going to give them a shot. They're not going to say that. But we say, okay, it's an audition. Try them out for 4 hours. If they show up for late or something, then we'll send you somebody else. If that works 4 hours, try another 4 hours, and try 8 hours, and then hire. But sometimes getting fired is the best thing for you. You don't value the job, you don't show up, and then we treat you. Next time, you've got to show up on time. And so the solutions aren't that complex. But government, both Democrats and Republicans, seem to believe in the self-made man myth to an extent. So again, now you said you disagreed. I want to make sure we have a dialogue. I want to hear.
First of all, I like what you said about the urbanization type of program. That's mindset, and that's a very important issue of retraining that, and that I hope that program that you started to mention about give a person a chance if they show up for work 5 days in a row, keep them going. But I see in my community, and in Monmouth County certainly, an enormous amount of jobs that need to be filled and are not filled. So I don't think that it's not, and I think the time has passed. Maybe 20 years ago, you couldn't find a job if you were a certain race or a certain culture or whatever. I don't see that today. Employers are dying for help. And I think they're less looking at race. And then they may be looking at experience and training.
Well, let me address that, but the young lady wanted to say something. Yeah. No, but I appreciate you being honest.
I think that, first of all, a lot of our truth is very relative because, and I don't mean to just call you out, but the woman who just commented and made that statement, things are very relative and now can look a whole lot shinier than it maybe did 20 or 30 years ago.
For sure.
But for somebody who is only 24, I don't even know what life is. I have friends, and we're all in the same age group relatively. My parents' friends are not even touching 60, okay? And they're very much in the job game. A lot of them are in managerial positions. I'm not making this up. Just last week, I was at my friend's house, and because my friends of color weren't around, and because my friend's mom had a single glass of wine, she felt liberated enough to let all of us know that because she's in a managerial position, if someone's name sounds black or sounds funny, she puts it away. I want to make it crystal clear this happens in liberal blue New Jersey, and this is very much alive, and I just wanted to acknowledge that. Unfortunately, it's very, very real.
And hopefully they'll catch her and fire her.
Yes, in the back.
I have to say, what you're talking about, well, my last name, my marriage name is Hennessy. Now, how many black people have the name of Hennessy? I was married to an Irishman in the service and working at Fort Monmouth. And I had a position that I handled computers and all that all over Fort Monmouth. When I made the appointments to meet with these people, they didn't expect to see me.
Mm-hmm.
Who are you waiting for? You have an appointment? So it's still goes on. I mean, even where I volunteer, it's the same thing. I am so-called a professional stylist for lunch break. And when I make appointments and people don't expect to see me, they expect to see someone else.
Mm-hmm.
So it still goes on.
Oh,
Yeah, it's scary.
You wanted one and then
Gil, when you mentioned reparations, I don't know if this is the right thing to say, but
and I haven't.
We want honesty tonight. This is what we're in family. This is family.
Joe
We want
will still
honesty.
like me, even if I make mistakes.
No.
But, and I haven't read in depth about the conversation. It just occurs to me, it's the wrong conversation. Our country has never atoned. This is the conversation we don't have. That we have never acknowledged what has been done to black people, let alone talk about atoning. The very concept being that we are all human beings. And it's not love or just love, it's not just tolerance, it's not just empathy, it's love. Where's the love? And I guess, you know, it ties in also into, you know, the topic for tonight. I have trouble, I think a lot of us have trouble keeping up with the conversation on sexuality. Because I can understand gay and I can understand trans and bi, and then I'm lost. And I have a couple of young friends, I invited them over, but just explain to me what's going on with you. You're trans, you're this, what's the conversation? And I was still like, okay, I hear what you're saying, I'm still trying to process it, and seems like they keep adding initials. And I'm sorry if I'm sounding ignorant, but that's all I wanted to say is, you know, this is can be solved if we acknowledge that we need to love each other.
Can I say this, Mr. Turner? I was called, someone in a meeting a couple of years ago called me cisgender, which is, of course, how do you define cisgender?
Someone who identifies.
But I
Identify with your.
using black terminology, I thought they were calling me out of my name. I had no idea what they were talking about. So you're right, but that's yeah.
The lady in the back.
Having been born the same year that picture was taken with you and Martin Luther King, I have friends that don't need to have wine to reveal how they really feel. And I tolerate them because I like to let them know that I love them in spite of their judgments. But today I had the ability to work from home, and I did so because I wanted to watch the congressional hearings. And I watched it from the beginning to the end. And I was very pleasantly surprised. I shouldn't say surprised, I was pleased to see many involved in all attributes of the day that were of color. And the amount of the newness of the congressional members, and it was just wonderful. We still have so much work to do. However, we just need to continue with discussion. We need to share with one another the concept of tolerance, and that we are all one. You cut, you bleed the same, and love is probably at the core of it all. So if we can share that with the younger generation, who, by the way, the millennials, they're going to change everything. They already are. So they are more tolerant than we will ever be, no matter how tolerant we pretest to be. And I think they're going to teach the children, or the generation coming behind them, that we may have some hope. And
there's a book, let me ask how many of you have heard of this. It's a book called Dear White Christians Still Looking for Reconciliation. It's Jennifer Harvey. It's worth getting because what she is saying is that there still is this desire for reconciliation. And she moves into a kind of a reparations mode. She simply talks about, she goes back to the time when I clearly was out there in terms of the Black Manifesto. But I mean, she is really the first white person whom I've read who gets that aspect of our history, who recognizes that rather than having kumbaya moments across racial lines, that there's this very history. There's this very history from the very get-go. Black people were in fact outside the gate, and there is a need for us, therefore, for all of the nation to be concerned about closing the gap. I mean, the statistic, I don't know whether you looked at them recently, but the gap between black wealth and white wealth, home ownership, et cetera, it relates to the way the nation began. And I guess while I'm talking, is there, some people are saying that there is a white fear of the browning and darkening of America. And I guess if in fact there is that, what is there about white DNA that makes that kind of insecurity? How do you put your...
But it's not, it's about change DNA. Human beings have trouble with change. It doesn't matter what it is. And this is a change. And their music, and again, it's the same thing. Our music is, this is the way, the people who voted for the president, this is the way the world is changing. And this guy is going to kind of keep the world the way it is. And it's not that bad people are, But I want to begin, I know you had your hand up, but I wanted to get back to your question. So there's some realities about the job market that people don't understand. Part of it is that there are a lot of low-level jobs. We've had probably more low-level jobs. A lot of people can't afford to do that. And what I mean by that is that you can work at Burger King or McDonald's, but that doesn't pay their mortgage. And that takes time away from them searching for a job that will actually pay. And so one of the privileges that some people have had is that, well, why don't you do that? Well, I did that when I was at. But they had the privilege of, if there was a gap between what they could pay, somebody, because of that, would cover that gap in their family. And so if you don't have that support in your family, working for 10 or 15, and it's ridiculous, the $15 minimum wage is ridiculous for politicians to think that that's going to solve anything.
Well, and it's not
You can't
coming
live.
for several years.
Yeah, it's not coming,
It's not happening now.
and it's not going to happen. But instead, and especially running an entrepreneurial institute, entrepreneurship is the answer. That instead, you need to create entrepreneurial. New Jersey should be supporting the creation of jobs through entrepreneurship. Because IBM's not going to come in here and hire people. Yeah, they're giving tax breaks to that. So part of the reality, and I will tell you, as someone who's over 45, 50, I can't get a job in corporate America. I have great credentials, but they would say, you cost too much, we can't mold you. I know so many people with Ivy League degrees who can't find a job. And so the reality is that we need to look at the job market. Yeah, there are plenty of jobs, and Reagan did the same thing. He opened up, look at the newspaper, all these jobs. Well, again, if you don't have that support and that gap, so one of the things in my dissertation I created, MIT has something called the living wage calculator. If any of you haven't looked at that, you should look online. And what it does is tell you what a household needs to make of any size in any county in the United States. And what I did is I took that against, I created something called the living wage index, which I looked at the census and I could tell you what percentage of households, based on an average of two adults and one child, need to make to survive. And it's pretty much $50,000 everywhere. The household has to make $50,000. And the poverty rate was created by a woman named Mary Orshansky in 1964, and she told the Johnson administration, don't use this for poverty, because it's just food security. So the poverty rate is based on food security, not transportation or housing or child care. And so yet Democrats and Republicans, nobody's raised the threshold. So when we're sitting there saying, well, these Democrats, these Republicans are for poor people, they're not. Because that would be the first thing you did. But the trouble is, and again, I'm not faulting anyone, if I was in the White House, I couldn't change that, because what that is doing is admitting America is not as great as it thought it was. And that 40% of America is poor. And poverty is not a number, it's really based on your inability to pay basic bills. And when you start looking at reality, and that's where I go to the safety trampoline, is that we need to begin to realize that for the health of this country, we've got to make sure that jobs that are available for the household, not low-level jobs, and we need to look at that. And frankly, Wharton controls Wall Street. Wall Street they're making too much money and they're not paying their share. One of the things that I'm going to push to this administration is I believe in tax cuts for job creators, not for people just because they're wealthy. And yet nobody seems to talk about that. They say, oh, give everybody, they'll trickle down, it'll trickle down. No, give it to people who actually create jobs. And yet nobody does that. So you begin to do that. But it's a great question. And so, yeah, in the back.
Back to your earlier point about the music we grew up with, okay? And the challenge in light of what happened in the United Methodist Church this week, the challenge of how do we get to the place where we can respect the fact that it's hard for us to change our music. And so when people are storming the gate, insisting in any rate, that we change the music. And I'm not even defending the music, okay? People are storming the gate and saying you have to change the music. You can look at the extreme left in the Democratic Party, for example, who's storming the gate saying we have to change the music. You can look at what happened in the Methodist Church today. People storming the gate, we have to change the music. And the fear that that creates for folks who may have a more traditional mindset in any of those areas, who are saying, if I don't build a bigger wall around traditionalism, whatever it happens to be, whether it's political, religious, okay, if I don't build a bigger wall around it, those people are going to tear at the foundations of the music I grew up with. And I'm old enough to be a fairly traditional person, and when I look at the Wesleyan Quadrilateral, I put Scripture first and put the other three legs on top of it, so it's a little harder for me. I'm a Baptist, not a Methodist. But when the attack is coming at those things that are the music that I hold dearly, it's very challenging for me. And I want to enter the conversation, and I want to learn the new music. But when I'm seen as evil, and that the only solution is to throw out my playlist and buy the new one, it's hard to have a conversation. Did I make sense?
I'm glad you said, because I learned this in coming up with this. That's what I learned, and I'm glad you said, and I need to hit on that, is that there's arrogance on all sides.
Yes.
And arrogance breeds stubbornness. And so when and I'm saying you've got to appreciate others. You don't have to like their music. I have to appreciate the racists for their music. They weren't born racist. But if I stormed the gate and said, you're an idiot, don't you understand that? Then they back off. And so I think part of the challenge, and that's what I'm saying, so only 26 different votes separated in the Methodist Church. And I told Dad if I had given a speech, not because it's me, but this music thing, it's amazing how it works. And you get people to understand, just tolerate someone else's music. And you're absolutely right, and I think that's what happens, is we get so on either side, and we need to begin to appreciate. And that's why I say the challenge to all of you is go to somebody you don't like, and ask them what their music, who are the influences in your life?
So do you think that the one church proposal, not specific, but I think it talks to all these issues.
Right.
The one church proposal said, we can agree that we don't agree.
Right.
Let's move together holding hands, which there are a lot of places where I think we need to do that.
Right.
We need to do that in the conversation on race. We need to do that in the conversation about economics. We need to do that on the issues of gender. We need to find ways that we can say, we don't agree, but we respect the personhood of the person with whom we disagree. Can't we find a way to walk forward together?
Right.
But I think there are too many people who aren't willing to hold hands with you until you say you agree. Until you capitulate that you agree with their point of view, they won't walk forward with you.
Right.
And I can't capitulate. It's got to be win-win. It can't be win-lose. And we need to find ways to have win-win conversations.
I wish we could say on this point, because that's so important, because I wonder, and let me just ask this, is there the possibility that Martin King's nonviolence, and of course I think what we need lessons in verbal nonviolence, to get at the very kind of thing you're saying, because in a sense we are hardening people rather than converting people, and therefore, and there's this, I face it myself, because am I getting soft, you see? Am I compromising the integrity of my position if in fact I demonstrate the capacity to be empathetic? I think that's something we've got to wrestle with. But the question is whether or not, Martin King talked about creating the beloved community, the beloved society. That's I guess we need to understand that in terms of human, and I think, will you say that Dale is onto something important?
Yes.
It's very important in terms of, it challenges those of us who are to the far left, or those who are to the far right. But I guess he's saying something, but in a sense, isn't this what America supposedly is? That it is a blending of differences. And somehow we've gone, I don't know, did we lose that at a particular, politically, et cetera? Was there a time in our history where there was a marvelous blending of Republican and Democrat? Can you say that there was a marvelous kind of fusion? Even never really. We've never been there. We talk that talk, but we don't walk that walk. Is that fair to say? But I think in terms of my as a change agent, I'm very concerned about that. So in the United Methodist Church, the idea was that this one church plan would allow for local option. That in fact people who out of conscience felt that they could not marry same-sex couples, that there was a place for them, and for those of us who have performed, a place for us. But part of the problem, I guess, is some people resisted that because that to be in a connectional church, as United Methodists are churches related to each other, that denies connectionalism because we're not uniform. But I guess we really need to wrestle with what it means to engage in unity without uniformity. And it looks like both within the church and in society.
But I'm kind of learning that it's not so much the issue, it's the interaction.
Okay.
And I know you want to say, and so often we spend so much time talking on the issue. So I'm a certified coach. I just finished a Rutgers coaching class, and they have something that I'm actually terming, which is called active communication. And then you start out with something called powerful questions, where you say, okay, well, you believe in the traditional. Well, tell me about it. Why do you believe that? And you start to get people to open up and really talk. And then you use their 4 levels of listening. And what we've done is level 1 is self-focused listening. Like, I can't wait till he finishes so I can talk, right? That's self-focused. And then you have active listening. So, okay, I'm kind of listening. I'm hearing some of that data. Then you have empathetic listening. I kind of feel where you're coming from. And the highest level is contextual listening, where I understand the influences where he's coming from. And we've lost that level. And so if we kind of work through this level where we have this self-focused listening, that's where we are, instead of this empathetic listening or contextual listening. And so it's not even the issue, and it's because most people are good. Most people have their music. But if we listen to each other in a way, and I've learned a lot in this coaching class, then that. So you wanted to say something.
Yeah, no, I'm David Pascal. I live in Red Bank. I'm chair to a committee in town, the Red Bank Human Relations Advisory Committee. We basically promote inclusiveness and diversity in town. And I live near the United Methodist Church on Broad Street, I guess.
Yes.
And for the last 10 years, I would drive by and I'm like, wow, that's a great church. I mean, they always have always welcoming to the LGBTQ community. They always have like a rainbow or something, or a sign or a message. And even though I'm really not a person of faith, I don't practice. I mean, I was raised a Catholic, but I don't practice. I love driving by that church. So I was disappointed today when I heard about that, because I thought, oh, the Methodist Church is the most inclusive. But then again, that was the Red Bank Church, because I was near it. But that doesn't mean the other churches are like that. So I'm curious, like, how many people voted today altogether? And what was the makeup of the voters in terms of their, their age and their race? I guess I'm curious because I hate to be an ageist, I don't like that, but do you know?
Sure, yeah. The General Conference, there were 864 delegates, I think, 864. Half are clergy, half are lay people.
Okay.
And of course, they come from all over the world, of course, the USA. But then, of course, in recent years, there's been a large development of United Methodism in Africa. And so therefore, we have a number of persons who are now African delegates, etc. Then, of course, the European delegates. And so those are the persons, they were elected by their local conferences. I mean, there are many conferences, which is here in New Jersey, it's called the Greater New Jersey Conference. And so every 4 years, they elect delegates to go to that international congress, that general conference, and to make those decisions. And therefore, what happened in 2016 when we had our last formal general conference, in an effort to sort of stifle the kind of negativity vis-a-vis gay people, we sort of set aside the punitive approach and say, let's see how we can create some solution to cut through this, because you read the New York Times, it talks about charging clergy for performing same-sex marriages for their children. And in fact, they've been suspended. And I've done one same-sex marriage myself, but I think I'm beyond getting caught now. But those are the ones who voted. But there is this challenge between the traditionalists, and this is where our colleague back there, in terms of the traditionalists, feel. Well, in fact, that's where the Bible gets in the way. You see, but because it's in fact,
their interpretation of the Bible gets
exactly.
Their interpretation,
exactly, because it's picking and choosing. You see, and this is where Strong is so very helpful, because you see, we talk about the Word of God, when in fact, I like the idea that the Bible was not dictated by God, but inspired by God. You get the difference? But if you believe it simply is the dictation of God's words, then therefore you assume that every word there,
not a
and
literal
knowing the
God.
contradiction,
Yeah,
it's God's word. And so just the contradictions you see that are there, and I guess that to me is the real challenge for the church. Because the church,
the numbers, but the numbers, so you know that 65% of the U.S. church actually voted for the one church. So most of the U.S. actually voted for it. But, and it was a 20.
And the one church is
Bishop said-
accepting of the.
Accepting of, well, let's say basically locally, you deal
Right.
with it locally.
Right.
You know, the 28 votes apparently would have swung it.
28
Out of the 800, 28 votes would have swung it. That's what I'm saying, not that I'm great, but I could have had this conversation with
Right.
people. We could have swayed, I know we could have swayed 28. I know it. But the other piece is, and this is where races that the African delegates were the ones that really swung it against. You know, because their music was, you know, in fact, one of the guys was interviewed and said, well, we would have been a laughing, if we went back and we would have been a laughing stock when we went back to Africa.
Yeah.
let me try something I've never tried. You were into mindfulness, aren't you?
Yeah.
I wonder, because I think we're into, I'm excited about what's happening here. I'm learning from my son, which I didn't think was possible. How can we, and Dale, I think you're good at this, you're into mindfulness. How could we stop for a few minutes in this gathering and sort of?
Well, they have a flow. Don't stop the flow.
Well, no. I'm serious about this. They're not stopping the conversation, not stopping the noise, but rather see what in a few moments of quietness we can internalize. I've never done this before. I mean, I've never stopped in the midst of an exciting conversation, but I just wonder if we stop.
What are you?
Well, the idea of that people to sort of hear internally what we've been talking about. You know, in a sense, I don't know, what's the concept of mindfulness?
Well, it's breathing, but I think a moment of silence would be fun. I mean,
Well, would you lead us?
Well, I'm not an expert. I don't want to. No, but people feeling the breath. Well, so does anybody do that? Anybody do mindfulness? You want to do a 4-minute
Provide
session?
some
I saw. Well, but I mean, are make sure people are okay. You know, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, we're not. Is that all right, guys?
Are people okay with that?
1 minute is gonna feel like.
We'll do 1 minute. Let's just do 1 minute.
You
So,
want,
yeah,
I'll
just
just
1
put
minute.
on my timer
Okay.
for a
Do
minute.
you want us to call out the breathing, or you just want silence, or what?
No, I think.
Well, the young lady in the
everybody
back, so she's done it.
Oh, no, but if you know, you can go
should-
ahead.
No, I don't think there's any one way.
Right.
I think if we all just agree to be quiet for a minute.
Should we be thinking?
Yes,
Well,
you can think, you can leave your mind blank, you can count your breaths, you can
Right.
ponder what we've been talking about. I don't think we should set a rule.
Okay.
The idea of being mindful is to be as present in your body as possible and to not be thinking about the future or the past. It is mindfulness is almost synonymous with being present, and it's being mindful of only what's happening right now and no further.
Okay.
I go to therapy, everybody, that's all. I go tomorrow, it's gonna be great. Yeah.
So I'll start the timer for 1 minute.
There you go.
Are you sure that was a minute? That was 5 minutes, wasn't it?
But we're so tied into these things. We don't spend time with ourselves. So the point, actually, the research shows that students, especially in urban areas, if they spend 15 minutes a day with that, it reduces recidivism and improves scores. You know, improve the student performance. So so that was good. And you've calmed the room down. Whatever, yeah, come on, yeah.
I have one more question
Yeah.
related to that, and I don't need to put you on the spot, because I know, I'm assuming ministry is a big commitment, but I heard that, I'm not sure if I heard it wrong, but were you retiring from ministry also in connection with yesterday's vote?
No, I mean, in Methodism, a pastor retires at the age of 70 automatically.
Okay.
So the active ministry, I retired earlier because of some physical issues, you see. But no, I'm wanting to respond, and I guess it'd be interesting to see what Dale and others think about when you've been pushing so hard, and this happens. But then, of course, I look at the black experience. We've been pushing for 400 years. You see, and of course there's a Broadway play years and years ago, "Stop the World, I Want to Get Off." You remember that many years ago. But I guess I don't know where I would get off to, and that's the question. And I'd be interested to know how do you? And this is a human experience when in fact a door gets slammed in your face or in the face of others. But how do you respond? I guess in different ways. I'd be interested in how you respond to that. Do you blast open the doors? Do you retreat? I guess, and then there's no real answer. But how would you respond to that?
Well, but again, I've learned with the coaching thing. I've learned this whole idea of powerful play. I respond instead of getting angry or other things. I want to kind of hear their music, and I want them to hear their music. See, part of the problem is that people don't hear their own music, right? And so they assume everybody has the same music.
Could I just say, a big part of it too is forgiveness. I mean, Pastor, if you could just share a little of your experience about your anniversary and going to the Mount Airy Lodge, and then what happened 50 years later.
Sure, exactly.
I mean, you have to have a forgiving spirit to have these things happen.
Yeah, well, I'm sure some of you know that story, but that's a marvelous story. Because really, I think it's the young people.
It is.
I'll say it. So it was on CBS News. That, I'm embarrassed that my 80-year-old parents went viral and I haven't got a video. So 6 million people saw their video. How many of you saw it? So a good number of you saw that. And so you want to
Well, the story is this. Of course, I do a lot of speaking in public schools, and I mentioned the fact that Grace and I got married November 30th, 1957 in Greensboro, North Carolina. I was a third-year student at Boston University School of Theology, and so I wanted to impress my bride-to-be by getting a reservation to a honeymoon lodge in the Poconos. And so in the papers I saw Mount Airy Honeymoon Lodge. And so I, of course, went through the process of getting a reservation, and I got one. And so after we got married in Greensboro, North Carolina, we drove from Greensboro to Mount Airy Lodge. As I walked in, I could tell that the atmosphere sort of inhabits, became strange. I walked up to the desk and presented a copy of my reservation, and the person hesitated a bit and wondered whether or not I had an authentic reservation. But then, of course, said, we can't accept you. We can't accept you because of race. We do not accept people of color. We don't accept Negroes at that time. He went on to say, and our guests would not be happy if we let you stay. And so after, of course, a lot of conversation, then, interesting enough, and I don't tell, Steve Harvey picked that up. We were also on Steve Harvey's show. They flew us out to L.A. But what happened is that I was a third-year student at Boston University School of Theology my last year, and being in training to be a Methodist minister, I said, why don't I go and see if I can find the local and white Methodist man? I don't think and I know full well if I find the Methodist preacher, he will go back with Grace and me and confront the people at that place. But lo and behold, he did not do that. Rather, he went to an old sort of broken down lodge that catered to black bear hunters. And he knew that, but in a sense, that's the Green Book idea, isn't it? He took us to a place where it would be accepted because rather than confronting the place that rejected us. And of course, we stayed there that one night and then went into, and so I told that story in Titusville, New Jersey, at Bear Tavern Elementary School, to a group of fifth graders. The fifth graders, unknowing to us and their teacher, decided that they would write the existing Mount Airy, now it's a casino resort, the original one out there. They wrote them, and their letters were so impressive. that place, one of the associates, the executive said, yes, we will treat the Caldwells to delayed honeymoon. And therefore CBS.
50 years later.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's right, yeah, yes. And that was picked up, and that became a CBS story. And then, of course, Steve Harvey, when he picked that up, he of course covered it, but then he and his company decided to give the fifth graders and their parents a 2-day stay at some wolf lodge in.
Oh, that's very nice. Oh, very nice.
That's another piece of that, so, but again, it's the fifth graders. That the fifth graders, that they were not Republicans and Democrats, et cetera, but they said that that's unfair. And those of you who remember seeing it, it brings tears to my eyes every time because the kids were emotionally moved that they were saying that's unfair. And that was a party pooper. And Bill and Grace should have been able to do that. And I guess, how do we lose that? What happens in our society when there is not that sense of responding to injustice?
Well, the powerful, again, because of the influences. So, but behind the scenes of that is, one, my dad rarely tells that story. And so when we went there, he talks about the water fountains. And you think in the bathrooms, the black bathrooms, the white bathrooms. And you think to us, that's more, but to young people, it's ridiculous. You have a pipe going here, and it's the same pipe.
Yeah.
Why do you have those two? That doesn't move kids at all. But there's a reason the emotional toll of that, they don't normally tell that. And so the Lord worked in mysterious ways, and I told you, and you told that. And then there's a reason young people think differently than older people. It's because of the internet. The people in my generation grew up not really knowing or caring there were poor people in the rest of the world. And what they said as we talked to them, to the young people, is that, that should be the happiest time in your life. And they denied that time for you to be happy. And that's what moved them. The other piece of the story is that the gentleman who was the VP of operations, who accepted, he only got one of the letters somehow. But he grew up and he had a broken home, but his black football coach was his mentor. And so the influence of all these things coming together, because it could have been some manager said, because it was a totally different management. He said, well, that wasn't us. It's going to be bad press if we do this because they're going to look like we were racist back then. Right. And so the confluence of influence-related events really did that. Now, having run a school, what happens is the kids, the influences of their influence to, and I have a 14-year-old, so the influences of friends today, not friends tomorrow. It hardens you. So as we get older and older, we're disappointed more and more influenced to be colder and colder instead of open and warm. And that's why I love the influence thing, because we really have to examine why we do what we do. And that behind the scenes, story. So someone else had, yeah. Okay.
I was going to say, Dr. Carl, that happened to me right here in Red Bank at Molly's Picture.
Oh, really?
Right.
Wow.
Same thing.
Honeymoon?
And they stated, we had the paper, stated it. My father was with me, and he was with the union at Bendix, and they would always have their meetings and everything. We ended up making a call. We ended up getting a room, but it wasn't the original room, and when we looked at it, it was a wall. When we looked at it, it was the wall. Couldn't see anything else. But what we did, we went down to the swimming pool. I've never seen so many people move.
Wow.
And who was singing there that night? It was Johnny Mathis.
Really?
Johnny Mathis. When we walked in to go to the bar.
If you don't mind, what year was that?
That was in 19...
We know you were married at 10 years old, so.
1970. It was 1970.
Okay.
1970.
But so let's take that. So you hear these stories. There are those in society that would say, yeah, you're right, that was then, this is now, why do you worry about that? And they don't have the sensitivity of the emotional toll that you're feeling less than. And that permeates the life of so many people, yet in America we don't want to talk about it.
It's the PTSD.
Yeah, there's a PTSD. It's RTSD, racist traumatic stress disorder. But then one of the things that annoys me, and I want you to listen to the TV. This is the 400th anniversary of slaves coming to America. How often do we hear that on TV, other than Spike Lee saying something? And think about this. If it was 400 years of anything else in America, we would be talking about it. The English did something to us. So-and-so did something to us. Yet 400 years where 20 slaves came to Virginia, we're not hearing about it. And so I encourage each of you to begin to say, again, we've come a long way, but we have a long way to go. Sorry, Dennis.
Well, let me ask this question. Is there a possibility that in America we are more sensitive to the Holocaust survivors than we are to segregation survivors?
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah.
And let's unwind that. Why? Why is that? Talk about that.
Because it's not us. It's not our original sin.
Because just like
Because
we
the Jewish leaders are more economically powerful and have more press. I think that is.
No, it's because what we said before is that America doesn't like to accept that we've done anything wrong.
Yeah.
So how are we gonna accept that we?
I see that. That's an interesting way you have your hand.
I'm sorry, I know I'm staff, but you know, one reason is the South was not punished sufficiently. You know, in Germany they said there's no monuments for the Nazis, and there's plenty of monuments to the Holocaust. And yet we have all these monuments to all these people who were basically traitors to the country. I mean, any West Pointer who went over to the South was taking up arms against the country and breaking his oath. You know, but they weren't hanged.
No.
You know.
But I guess the fact that it happened in Europe, it happened in Germany, and not in the USA.
Yeah.
Correct, exactly.
That was the
That's
point I
what
was
you were
going to
gonna
make.
say.
It happened somewhere else, so it's not our shame.
Right.
And the world made them pay reparations. Who is making our country pay reparations?
Would it be
We
fair?
have to do it,
I'm
we have to
feeling-
do it to ourselves.
I'm feeling my way.
Willing.
I'm feeling my way. Would it be fair to say that in fact the existence of Israel is a reparational response?
Absolutely.
What about the Asians?
And
Yes.
then they receive reparations.
What did they receive? I didn't know
I think
that.
$30,000, I believe, each
Yes.
family. Yeah, that was for But I get, let's the temperature, this is talking some heavy, important stuff. How do you assess, what does that do to us when I raise those kinds of questions in this room? Does the atmosphere change among us as we talk about the differences between Holocaust survivors and segregation survivors? I said, how do you measure when in fact?
Well, but it's not either or. I mean, again, and that's why the contrast is that what's right is right, and what's wrong is wrong. And I think I don't think it's not about drawing that contrast. It's really talking about what is it in the human dynamic that allows these things to happen. And many say we're moving in a stage now of the world's in chaos of hate and other things. And it's not just one man that's doing this. There are people around the world, and we need to call the question. And so I think it's not just those. But part of what the powers that be want is this comparison: conservative, liberal, north, south, Jewish, black. And the more we fight, the more we realize that there's I believe that capitalism, we don't have democratic capitalism. Apple pays less in taxes than the local pizza shop. So it's not, and capitalism can be socially positive. It's a way to do that. Yeah, good. What were you gonna say?
And to speak on that, I think that a lot of it goes to how individualistic our country is. Our country, for better or for worse, was founded on individualism, and that's something we love until it bites us in the butt. And I feel like when we're such a conglomeration of so many ethnicities, so many backgrounds, so many identities, number one, but number two, that is coupled with not my chair, not my problem. I'm not black, so that's not my thing. I'm not genderqueer, so that's not my thing. And then, if it is our thing, we think that we got to talk over those people, and we got to talk for them. We got to break through that wall and start realizing, I don't have to take the microphone, but I do need to understand that just because I'm not gay, that doesn't mean that that their mistreatment is not also my problem. I have to understand, and that's where empathy comes in, that when they're not being treated well, we all aren't being treated well. But it's that not my responsibility, I'm not getting involved. And I think that that's also what creates that, or what keeps that divide there.
Exactly.
When did we
Yeah.
put into operation, some of you remember these words, it was a man named Martin Niemöller in Germany. Of course, the Germans,
Okay.
Martin Niemöller. But of course, when they came for the Jews, the trade unionists, the Catholics, I did not speak up, but then when they came to me, there was no one left to speak up. Now, can that resonate? I mean, is there a way of getting at that in fact that we must identify, maybe that's self-interest, we must identify with the struggles of other people, because if they went to get them, then there may have been time when they're getting buzzed. And I guess I'm wondering at this point, and again, not being political, but is there enough pain and distress in our nation at this point, seeing the problems of Washington and society, that in fact people are beginning to realize that it's us that are being hurt by the system.
Right.
And that in a sense, it's not simply people of color, but those of us who, the whitest of the white, are discovering that there is something about the economic system that has a few people at the very top with a lot of money, and the rest of us are struggling. And I'm wondering, I'm putting that out, so I know we're beginning.
I think we're at time now, so we need to really wrap it up.
We
So.
can, a couple more minutes. I do
Okay.
want to remind everyone also about the newspaper articles that
Okay.
I would really like them to take with them. I mean, the thing is, we've gotten off topic at times tonight. There's so much to discuss. We just need you to come back again.
Yeah, but this discussion has to happen.
About when we first started and the things that you've encountered, Reverend Caldwell, your whole life. I think that is something for us to remember, that there is a lot more work and we do need to speak up. And it's one thing to have this conversation here, but when it's with our friends, like as a white person that are worried about the drowning of America, instead of sitting there quietly while they say these things, all of us in this room, if just each one of us went out there and said something when somebody was talking and you tried to make them understand another man's story. I mean, whether, I'm a librarian, so it's about stories, not music, but we all have a story, and that's why we're the way we are. And if we share these stories, then we understand each other a bit more.
Final comment, please, from me.
Sure.
In a sense, this has been one of the most stimulating experiences I've had. And in fact, because I'm not sure that it was off topic, but rather there has been, and maybe that's sometimes our problem, that we're pigeonholing, we're engaging in kind of a silo, when in fact things are interrelated. I know you know that, but we're talking about the intersectionality. But it just seems to me that there's been a dynamic, and I say that in this present, I'm deeply impressed by what Dale brings to this. And I guess Dale has the Dale Caldwell Foundation. And I wish, as we talk about philanthropy, I wish that somehow some things could happen vis-a-vis your foundation that enables you to do what you're doing. Because I think you're point on. You're right on in terms of what you're saying. And that's the answer to the polarization of these moments. And to see this happening in the library, I guess I'm hoping, that's what I was hoping, I put something out today, I was hoping that the press would show up tonight. I was hoping that media would show up tonight. I would hope that other kinds of things, so that there would be a story in the paper tomorrow morning about what happened. It doesn't stay in the library or Las Vegas, but rather go, and it's a video. Oh, the whole
Does it go on YouTube?
Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yes. Oh, yes.
Oh,
I'm sorry, I should have
On the
announced
website.
that in
Oh,
the
okay.
beginning.
Oh, I see.
We did video record this tonight because we want to share it with more.
How do you get this viral? How do you get what happened? Is there, because in a sense, I mean, that's the final thing, but is there, what do you do with what you reported? Like, what happened
Well,
with
we
that?
want to put it on the webpage, so
is that what
people
happened?
can,
Oh, I see.
they will be able to see this conversation
Oh, okay.
and,
How many people look at your page?
What if 30
Billions.
people send the link to that YouTube video to the local newspaper?
Yeah.
What if everybody here who has an email account sends that link?
I can copy the link to Facebook and blow it up on Facebook.
I will do that, please do that, use the media.
Instagram, whatever, so, okay, it'll be up tomorrow.
Yeah.
And I think that just the connecting is that this is about gender equity, but it's really about every one of these issues about how human beings relate to other people. And I think that some will say, oh, well, you just talk about this topic. And I think, and I hope, for this, they see that this is a much bigger topic. It's about human interaction. And if we can get that right, these issues are easy. If we become comfortable being uncomfortable, realize that's the new world, it's so much easier and
Just
more
think if
interesting.
everybody was all like us, it would be fantastic.
So again, I know we're at time, and is there any last question or anybody?
Can I just mention, I don't know if the book, that you have the book up there, White Fragility. I read the book White Fragility, and I think white people should read it.
It's great.
Oh, you read it too?
Yeah.
It really is very good, and it covers a lot of these things, and I just recommend it.
In terms of the book idea, when I was in Denver, I think I must have shared that before, but when I was in Denver as a pastor there, they had this marvelous, and I thought, library-oriented book idea. One city, one book.
Yeah.
We're trying to do that.
To have everybody reading that kind of book in this community. And one of the things is that in book clubs that are homogeneous, people are willing to look at that because they can let down their hair. So you're not creating artificial interracial groups, but all white groups or all black groups can read a book like that and really dig deep. I don't know, what does it take to get that done here?
Well, we're looking for a book now. We talked about The Hate You Give, but we have some other books that we're looking into, and then we just have to try to get it.
Is that a library and politically initiated kind of idea?
Well, we as a library want to do this, but then we would have to somehow get it approved by the borough and get it out there.
Do you have a question?
I don't really have, well, maybe it is a question. I have a group of people that we get around and we talk about different things. And at my age, we're all learning. We talking sexual and the transgender and all that. And it was very comfortable, and we were going back and forth, and we were accepting of every thing, and like trying to understand it, like these different terms. But everybody was pretty okay with everything. It was like, we needed to open up and understand them, and they were people like us, and they were all right. Then we started talking race, and it got heated, and it got ugly, and people were saying things, and I had to stop it and say, not in my house. I want you to have a discussion, but this hatred, it's not going to happen in my house. I was so surprised by that. We've been discussing this for 400 years. How come we haven't got to the point that we can be comfortable talking about it?
It's power.
And what do we do?
It's power and economics. Power and economics.
Well, but it's part of the problem, and so if you're coaching somebody, and I'm working with a lot of family businesses, the worst thing you do is silence. We have family members, and it exacerbates, it gets worse. So I'm working with a family where the brother and sister haven't talked for 8 years. And they're manufacturing in their mind reasons, and it's one small little thing really separated them, and they manufacture. And I think we're dealing with that with this issue. The original sin is some of the presidential candidates have said. And by not talking about it, and really saying that the self-made man, everybody has equal chance. You've been here long enough. Now, one of the other things that we need to talk about, and that's why we're actually starting something called the 1619 Forum, maybe to really begin to talk about where people who are descendants of slaves in America. And if you look at the black percentages, and my ex-wife and others, and I admire my folks, my friends from Jamaica and from Africa, but their influence and their mindset is that they grew up that they could be anything they want to be. Mm-hmm. They could be a bank manager, so they come over here and see the opportunity and say, I can be anything I want to be. Mm-hmm. Yet those of us who come from families, and I have the privilege of, and so the elite in the black community are the ministers. I have 4th-generation ministers. So part of the reason I'm here is because I come from this family. If I didn't have a ministerial family and I was descendant of slaves, I would be like anybody else. And so that's part of the reality. We haven't had the conversation about multi-generational African Americans in the United States. And we're calling this a 1619 forum. To really have that, and not a blaming, but to really talk about this idea of the safety trampoline. How do we save America by dealing with it? Yeah. So, okay.
I just wanted, I want to say one thing about racism and anti-Semitism.
Sarah, you gotta speak up. We can have one more comment.
We had a hand back there, or?
Well, I don't want to bring the conversation down, that's all, but just as a black person, and this woman is talking about her and her friends, who I assume are white, in her home, and this gal back here is talking about her friend's mom, and what she said about, African American sounding names, which my name was Sierra Canary, so I guess I'd be out the window. And you're talking about young people, like as a black person who has black children, and I understand trying to relate to where people are coming from, I absolutely believe in that, and on a one-on-one basis, yes, but in the world, when my kids go out, and they're looking for a job, or they're going to the store, they don't know what you think by looking at you. You're a cute white lady who's 35 years old, and I don't know that your mom told you last night, don't trust these black people. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
so I tell my kids, you don't know what anybody, this could be Archie Bunker, or it could be somebody who comes to the Let's Talk About Race class. You just don't know when you are dealing with somebody what's in their head. So that is getting me frustrated back here. And also, you talked about the hope of the young generation, and I totally, when Barack Obama was president, I believed in that. And I'm biracial. I have the family that I'm closest to is white. But I have a daughter who goes to Red Bank Regional, and if I show you the pictures of the N-word on the blackboard, and how many, just seriously, yesterday one of her friends was asking her, is it okay to say the N-word, and when can I say it, and when can't I say it, and ding, 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 and it's like, I don't know, I'm just discouraged because I feel like we're going backwards.
And the trauma,
and it affects this young generation. And they're going to grow up and tell their kids these things.
And the trauma of those incidents, that's what's overlooked, is that those incidents actually have deep trauma when you experience them. And when kids touch your skin, and they want to touch your hair, and they want to do that stuff. And that's what I think people don't understand. That is real trauma. And that changes things. And then not to mention the influence of watching movies, and where the blonde hero wins, and the black woman's always the energetic, funny one, and this, the stereotypes. That's why the Oscars really annoyed me. Here you have Green Book, and they're all white people making it, and so that's the reality we have to talk about. We have to be honest.
You have to proceed with hope, but the fact is, there's still stories about Airbnb, and you call up and you say your name's Dawn White, and you sound white, but then you go to get the B&B, and it's learned that you're not white, and suddenly it's not available. That has not changed. I mean, maybe it's better, but it's still happening.
Olivia Spencer is African American, and she was the producer of Green Book. You said they were all white.
No, there were two black people on stage. If you look at the faith, I think there were 2 or 3 black people on stage.
Not only that, they did not consult the family. And the family's angry about the movie.
It's just symbolic of, and again, the point is that we need to be, as a society, more sensitive to be able to talk about stuff and hear other people.
Now I get in this 2 things I wanted to say. I wonder, there was a time when in fact we felt that really, to get at some of what we're talking about, is that white-only groups, whites need to work with whites. Because it's difficult for people of color in a group like this. to see where people are in terms of what they're wrestling with. And that's the difficulty within the racial groups, because in a sense, we have to put up with a lot of stuff. It's important that white folk let their hair down. But sometimes as they let their hair down, it infuriates those of us who are people of color. Because in terms of where they are at a sophomore level. And so the question is, there was a time when in fact talking about white-only groups, dealing with white racism. I don't know how you get at that. That's one thing to think about. The final thing, I guess, I wanted to go back to the whole matter of Holocaust survivors and segregation survivors. There is, of course, an issue in terms of anti-Semitism in even the women's movement, etc. But one of the things that I've said, and of course I've talked to Rabbi Klein about this, and he and I see things a bit differently there, but one of the things that's important for us to realize is that there was a shooting of black people in a church in Charleston, South Carolina. And there was a shooting of Jews in Pittsburgh. And now, sometimes it's important for us to recognize that, but because in a sense, the whiteness of the Jewish community makes it therefore possible in terms of white privilege. But at the same time, we must not be insensitive to the reality of anti-Semitism. And that's something we're wrestling with. And of course, right now, there's a real interesting struggle in terms of people who are criticizing Israel being viewed as anti-Semitic. And that's an interesting, that's another kind
Whole
of
other issue.
Well, we have a lot from other programs, so you really do have to come back.
Close at 9. I would want people to have some